He faced a threat that seemed unstoppable until heavenly protection intervened in a miraculous way. Life out here in the woods was supposed to be simple. Quiet mornings with the smell of pine in the air, long afternoons by the creek, and the occasional visit to town for supplies. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was mine, and after years of living in the chaos of the city, it was the peace I thought I needed. That morning, though, felt different. It's hard to put into words. Nothing outright alarming happened, but there was this weight in the air, like the silence wasn't just a lack of noise. It was something more, something unnatural. I remember stepping out onto the front porch with my coffee, staring into the woods. Normally, the forest felt like an old friend, its branches swaying lazily in the wind, birds chirping and squirrels scurrying about. But not that day. The trees stood stock still, as if holding their breath, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves far off, almost as if something was moving through the woods, but not in a way I could see. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking things. That happens when you live alone for too long. Your mind fills the silence with imaginary threats. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease bubbling up in my chest. I decided a trip to town would do me good, give me a chance to shake the cobwebs and hear some human voices. By the time I reached the general store, the feeling hadn't gone away. The store was usually bustling with locals swapping stories, but even it seemed quieter than usual. Mrs. Taylor, who ran the place, barely looked up from her register as I walked in. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by something colder, distracted even. "Morning, Ethan," she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Morning," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Quiet day, huh?" She shrugged without a word, her focus glued to the counter. I brushed it off and went about my shopping, picking up canned goods, batteries, and a fresh loaf of bread. On my way to the register, I noticed Pastor Graham standing by the bulletin board. He was pinning up one of his flyers for the next Sunday service, his hands trembling slightly. Now, Pastor Graham wasn't a man to rattle easily. He'd been through enough in his life to make most people look like amateurs, floods, fires, personal losses, you name it. But as I approached, I noticed his eyes darting around the store, like he was expecting something, or someone, to jump out at him. "Pastor," I said, giving him a nod. "Everything all right?" He startled, nearly dropping the thumbtack he was holding. "Ethan," he said, his voice shaking a little. "Good to see you. I didn't notice you there." I frowned. "You sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He hesitated, his eyes locking onto mine. And then he said it, the words that changed everything. "It's coming. I don't know how, but it's coming for you." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What's coming?" I asked, half expecting him to laugh it off as some kind of joke. He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Something dark. I've been feeling it for days now. At first, I thought it was just me, but last night," he broke off, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Last night, I had a dream. No, not a dream. A warning." I didn't know what to say. Pastor Graham wasn't the kind of guy who believed in fairy tales or overreacted to his imagination. If he was this shaken, then he genuinely believed what he was saying. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you think is coming, but I've got my shotgun back at the cabin, and I'm not exactly helpless. Whatever it is, I can handle it." His grip tightened on my arm. For an older man, he was surprisingly strong. "This isn't something you can shoot, Ethan. You need to be ready in another way. You need to pray." "Pray?" I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out more nervous than amused. "Pastor, with all due respect, I haven't prayed in years." "That doesn't matter," he said firmly. "What matters is that you start now. You can't face this alone. You need protection, the kind only God can provide." I wanted to brush him off, tell him he was being ridiculous, but something in his eyes stopped me. There was a desperation there, a kind of fear I'd never seen before. This wasn't just some sermon or a plea to fill the pews on Sunday. He believed every word he was saying, and a part of me, deep down, wondered if I should too. Still, I couldn't bring myself to take him seriously. "All right, Pastor," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll think about it." He didn't look convinced. "Promise me," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Promise me you'll pray tonight. Even if it's just a few words." I nodded, more to get him off my back than anything else. "Sure, I'll pray. Promise." That seemed to satisfy him, at least a little. He let go of my arm and stepped back, giving me one last look. "Be careful, Ethan. And if you feel it, if you sense it's close, don't try to fight it on your own. Call for help." I didn't know what he meant by it, but the way he said it made my stomach twist. I paid for my supplies and left the store, his words echoing in my mind all the way back to the cabin. The drive home felt longer than usual, the winding forest road darker than it should have been, even in the afternoon. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the unease I'd felt that morning had turned into something heavier, like a stone in my chest. I told myself it was just the pastor's words getting under my skin, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something was coming, and I wasn't ready. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the treeline. The golden light filtering through the woods should have been calming, but instead, it cast long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should, like they were reaching for me. I shook off the thought and unloaded my supplies, carrying them inside and double-checking that I'd locked the door behind me. Paranoia. That's all it was. Just a seed planted by Pastor Graham's cryptic warning. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension in my chest. Even as I went through the motions, stowing canned goods, replacing the batteries in my flashlight, it felt like I was waiting for something to happen. Like the calm wasn't calm at all, but the quiet before a storm. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner. The sizzle of bacon in the pan was a familiar comfort, the smell filling the small cabin and momentarily pushing away the unease. I sat down at the table, fork in hand, but my appetite had vanished. My eyes kept drifting to the window, where the trees swayed slightly in the fading light. Were they moving more than they should? Or was that just my imagination? I forced myself to eat, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Pastor Graham had spooked me, that was all. His words were still playing tricks on my mind. "It's coming for you," he'd said. What did that even mean? Was it a person? An animal? A figment of his imagination? The sun slipped away completely as I washed the dishes, leaving the world outside wrapped in darkness. Normally, I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I'd chosen this life because it offered an escape from the noise of the city. But tonight, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, pressing in on me from every side. I tried to settle down by the fire with a book, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, my eyes darting to the shadows flickering on the walls. When the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, it felt less like a natural sound and more like a warning. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I decided to step outside, figuring some fresh air might help clear my head. Grabbing my shotgun, a precaution I told myself was unnecessary, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a slap. The woods were eerily still, the wind that had been howling moments ago suddenly gone. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel as I took a few steps forward. Then I saw them. Tracks. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, bear maybe, but as I crouched down for a closer look, my stomach turned. They were huge, far too big for any animal I knew of, and the spacing was off, almost like whatever made them was walking on two legs. But the worst part was the shape. The prints weren't paws or hooves. They were something else entirely, something I couldn't quite make sense of. A low growl rumbled through the air, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. My head snapped up, my heart pounding in my ears. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, thicker, like they were alive. I scanned the tree line, my fingers tightening around the shotgun, but I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I backed up toward the cabin, my pulse racing. The growl came again, louder this time and closer. I turned and hurried inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the flashlight and swept the beam across the windows. The glass reflected my own pale face back at me. But beyond that, the woods were an impenetrable wall of black. Then the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. The faint glow from the fireplace, the only thing keeping me from being swallowed whole. I fumbled with the flashlight, clicking it on and off again, as if expecting it to suddenly fail too. The beam of light cut through the gloom, but it did little to ease my nerves. That's when I saw the claw marks. They were etched deep into the wood just outside the window, long and jagged, as if something with massive talons had been trying to get in. My breath caught in my throat as I ran the flashlight over the marks, my mind racing. Those hadn't been there earlier. Whatever made them had been here while I was inside, completely unaware. A noise from the back of the cabin made me freeze. It was a soft scratching at first, then a heavy thud like something testing the strength of the walls. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as I crept toward the sound, shotgun in hand. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound firm. There was no answer, just another thud, louder this time. The whole cabin seemed to shudder with the force of it. I aimed the flashlight at the back door, my palms slick with sweat. The scratching had turned into a low, guttural growl, so deep it made the floor vibrate. Whatever was out there, it wasn't small, and it wasn't scared of me. I had a choice. Open the door and face whatever was outside, or stay inside and hope it went away. Neither option felt particularly promising. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and then came the sound of wood splintering. The doorframe shook as something slammed against it with terrifying force. My instincts kicked in. I raised the shotgun and fired through the door, the deafening blast echoing through the cabin. For a moment, everything was silent. No groaning, no scratching, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then it laughed, a deep, guttural laugh, filled with the kind of malice I'd never heard before. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. My knees felt weak as I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The door rattled again, harder this time, and I realized with horrifying clarity that whatever was outside wasn't going to stop. My mind raced, desperate for a solution. That's when Pastor Graham's words came back to me. Pray, Ethan. Pray like your life depends on it. I hadn't prayed in years, but in that moment, I didn't care. I dropped to my knees right there on the cabin floor, clutching the shotgun with one hand and clasping the other in front of me. God, I whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know if you can hear me, but I need help. Please. I can't do this alone. The growling stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then from somewhere deep in the woods came a howl, a sound so unearthly, it sent shivers down my spine. Whatever was at my door turned and ran, its footsteps fading into the night. I stayed there on the floor, trembling, too afraid to move. The cabin was silent again, but I knew this wasn't over. Something was out there, and it wasn't finished with me. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My knees pressed into the hard cabin floor as I clutched the shotgun like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My prayer had been desperate, almost incoherent, but something had happened. The growling, the scratching, the laughing, it was gone. Whatever had been outside, whatever had been trying to get in, had fled. But why? The silence was unnerving. Not a single sound came from the forest beyond the walls. No wind in the trees, no distant rustle of animals. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I finally managed to stand, every muscle in my body protesting as I did. The flashlight in my hand shook so badly the beam jittered across the walls, and my sweaty grip on the shotgun felt precarious. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deeply, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. But the question kept circling in my mind. What now? The back door was in ruins. The thing outside, whatever it was, had splintered the wood, leaving jagged edges and deep claw marks that cut through the grain. The air that seeped through the cracks felt colder than it should have been, biting against my skin. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. The cabin had been my sanctuary for years, but tonight it felt more like a trap. I needed to leave. I moved cautiously to the window, keeping the shotgun close. The flashlight beam swept over the trees, but I saw nothing. No glowing eyes, no movement in the shadows. My truck was parked just a few feet from the front porch. If I could make it there, I might have a chance to escape. But the thought of stepping outside made my chest tighten. Whatever had come to my door hadn't gone far. I could feel it, like a weight pressing on my shoulders. Gathering what courage I had left, I slung the shotgun over my shoulder and grabbed my keys from the table. I packed a small bag, flashlight, extra shells, water, and a few essentials before slipping it on. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. The broken door creaked softly as the wind pushed against it, and I froze, straining to hear anything outside. Nothing. I took a deep breath, gripping the keys so tightly they bit into my palm. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, I yanked the door open and bolted for the truck. The cold night air slapped me in the face as my boots crunched against the gravel. My eyes darted wildly, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. My truck loomed ahead like a lifeline, its metal frame glinting faintly under the pale moonlight. I reached the door, fumbling with the keys as adrenaline made my hands clumsy. The sound of the key slipping into the lock felt deafening, but I managed to get it open and threw myself inside. Slamming the door shut, I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. I twisted the key again, harder this time, as if sheer willpower could force the truck to start. The engine coughed, but refused to turn over. Panic clawed at me as I glanced out the window, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back. The third try worked. The engine roared to life, and I nearly cried with relief. I threw the truck into reverse, backing up too quickly and sending gravel flying. The headlights illuminated the woods behind me, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. I didn't wait to see if anything was there. Slamming the gear shift into drive, I hit the gas and tore down the dirt road. The truck's tires skidded slightly on the loose gravel, but I didn't slow down. My eyes flicked between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of pursuit. The forest seemed endless, the darkness outside the headlights impenetrable. Every turn of the road felt like it stretched longer than it should, as if the woods were trying to trap me within their twisting paths. Then I heard it, a howl, low, guttural, and inhuman, echoed through the trees. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever had been at the cabin was following me, and it was fast. The howl came again, closer this time, and I swore I could feel the vibration of it in my bones. "Come on," I muttered, urging the truck to go faster. The road was narrow, lined with dense trees on either side. If I lost control, there'd be no recovering, but slowing down wasn't an option. Not with that thing out there. The next sound was worse. Heavy footsteps, impossibly loud, pounding against the earth. It sounded like something massive was running alongside the truck, keeping pace. My blood ran cold as I dared to glance out the passenger side window. For a moment, I thought I saw it, a shadowy form, hulking and fast, darting between the trees. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck groaned in protest but surged forward, the speedometer climbing. The pounding footsteps faded slightly, but the sense of being hunted didn't. My eyes stayed glued to the road, scanning for any obstacles, any turnoffs that might offer a better escape. The road forked up ahead, splitting into two paths. I didn't think. I just chose the left, skidding as I made the turn. The truck lurched, gravel spitting out from under the tires, but I kept going. The footsteps faded completely, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost it. Then the truck died. The engine sputtered once, twice, and went silent. The headlights flickered and went dark, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt alive. My hands shook as I turned the key again and again, but the engine refused to start. My flashlight was in the bag, but I didn't dare move to grab it. My breath came in shallow gasps as I listened to the silence, waiting for the next sound. It didn't take long. A growl, low and menacing, rumbled from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, my body frozen with fear. The moonlight filtered through the trees, just enough to illuminate the road. And there it was, a shadowy figure, too large to be human, stood in the middle of the path. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly red that sent chills racing down my spine. It didn't move, didn't charge. It just stood there, watching me. I reached for the shotgun, my movements slow and deliberate. My fingers closed around the stock, and I raised it, aiming straight at the figure. My hands shook so badly the barrel wavered, but I forced myself to stay focused. "Stay back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, before taking a slow step forward. I fired. The blast lit up the darkness for a split second, and the figure vanished into the shadows. My ears rang from the noise, and I quickly reloaded, my hands trembling. But when I looked again, the road was empty. Whatever it was gone. For now. The silence after the shot was deafening, like the entire forest had paused to hold its breath. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough to drown out every other sound. I kept the shotgun raised, my eyes scanning the road ahead, the trees, the shadows, anything that might reveal where the creature had gone. Nothing moved. The darkness pressed in around me, heavier than it had been before. My truck sat lifeless, its once reliable engine now as silent as the rest of the world. The cold crept in through the windows, seeping into my bones. Every breath felt sharp and shallow, my body refusing to calm down. I thought about running, abandoning the truck, and making a dash into the woods, but the idea seemed suicidal. Out here in the thick of the forest, I didn't stand a chance. Whatever that thing was, it had chased me with terrifying speed. I had no reason to believe it couldn't do the same again. The truck, even dead, was the closest thing I had to shelter. I wasn't about to leave it unless I had no other choice. And then, just when I thought I might have some semblance of calm, it came back. At first, it was just a faint sound like wind stirring the branches. But then I heard the growl again, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. My body tensed, every muscle ready to spring into action, even though I didn't know what action to take. The growl turned into a laugh, a deep, mocking sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was close. I gripped the shotgun tighter, pointing it toward the sound. The barrel wavered slightly as my hands trembled. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry through the night. "I'm armed. Don't come any closer." The laughter stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence returned. I dared to hope it had left, that maybe the shot I'd fired had scared it off. Then the truck shook. It wasn't a subtle movement. The entire vehicle rocked violently, as though something massive had slammed into it. I screamed instinctively, my voice raw with terror, and scrambled into the corner of the driver's seat, pressing myself as far away from the windows as possible. My flashlight was in my bag on the floor, but I was too afraid to reach for it. The growling was louder now, vibrating through the metal frame of the truck. Whatever was out there, it was circling me, testing me like a predator playing with its prey. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. It was wrong, unnatural in a way that defied explanation. This wasn't just an animal. This was something else. God, I whispered, my voice barely audible. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly keep the shotgun steady. If you're there, I need you. Please. I can't do this. I didn't know why I said it. Maybe it was Pastor Graham's words echoing in my mind. Maybe it was sheer desperation. Whatever the reason, the moment the words left my lips, something changed. The growling stopped. The silence that followed wasn't like before. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was warm, like the air itself had shifted. I blinked, confused, and then I saw it. A faint glow, like the first rays of sunrise breaking through the darkness. It started small, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it grew quickly, filling the cab of the truck with a soft, golden light. At first, I thought it was my flashlight, but then I realized it was coming from outside. Slowly, cautiously, I turned to look through the windshield. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall and radiant, cloaked in shimmering light that seemed to pulse and ripple like a living thing. The figure wasn't solid, not entirely. It was as though it was made of light itself, its edges glowing so brightly that they blurred against the darkness. But even with the brightness, I could make out the details, the gleaming armor, the flowing robes, and in its hand, a sword that looked like it had been forged from the sun. My mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it real? Was I hallucinating? The light was so bright, it filled every corner of the truck, banishing the shadows that had been suffocating me moments before. The figure turned its head toward me, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt its gaze. Warmth spread through me, calming my racing heart and stilling my trembling hands. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt safe. "You are not alone," the figure said. The voice wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It echoed in my mind, resonating deep in my chest. It wasn't a voice I heard with my ears. It was something else entirely, something I felt. The creature growled again, louder this time, as if in defiance of the light. I turned my head sharply, and there it was, standing at the edge of the road. Its hulking form was just as terrifying as before, its glowing red eyes filled with rage. But now, in the presence of the light, it seemed smaller, less invincible. The figure stepped forward, raising the sword. The creature let out a guttural scream, a sound so piercing and unnatural that I had to cover my ears. It lunged toward the figure, its massive claws outstretched, but the figure didn't falter. The sword came down in a flash of blinding light, and the creature froze mid-charge. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the creature dissolved into black smoke. The smoke swirled violently, twisting and writhing, before being sucked into the ground. The road was quiet once more, the darkness retreating as if afraid of the light. I stared, unable to move or speak, as the figure turned back to me. The sword disappeared, fading into the light that surrounded it. "You are protected," it said, "but the battle is not over. Stay vigilant." Before I could respond, the figure began to fade, the golden light dimming until it was gone completely. The warmth lingered, though wrapping around me like a protective shield. I sat there in the truck, stunned, the world outside slowly returning to normal. The engine sputtered to life without me even turning the key, and the headlights flickered on. The road ahead was clear, the forest still and quiet. Whatever had been hunting me was gone. For now, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. The figure's words echoed in my mind. The battle is not over. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone. I sat in the truck for what felt like an eternity, staring out at the now quiet road. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, and my heartbeat was only just beginning to slow. The golden warmth left behind by the radiant figure still lingered faintly in the cab, like sunlight streaming through a window on a cold winter day. What had just happened? I replayed the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. The creature, the hulking, impossible beast, had been moments away from tearing me apart. Its growls, its claws, its mocking laughter, they'd all been so real, so vivid, that there was no denying their existence. But then the figure had appeared. That light, that overwhelming sense of peace and power, had driven the thing away like a shadow vanishing before the dawn. My brain struggled to process it all. Was it an angel? A guardian? Something else entirely? All I knew was that it had saved my life, and the creature had feared it. Finally, I forced myself to move, my muscles stiff and reluctant. The truck's engine was humming softly, almost reassuringly, as if the vehicle itself was telling me it was safe to go. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see glowing red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road, lined with towering trees that no longer felt as menacing as they had before. I shifted into gear and started driving, my hands still shaking slightly. The forest seemed quieter now, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by the creature, it was gone at least for the moment, but by something else. The presence of the figure lingered in my thoughts, its words echoing over and over. You are protected. Stay vigilant. By the time I reached the main road, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep over the horizon, casting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The sight should have been comforting, but it only served to remind me how close I'd come to not seeing another sunrise. I needed answers, needed to know what I was dealing with and why it had come after me. I didn't have a plan, but I knew where I needed to go. Pastor Graham. The drive into town felt surreal. The streets were empty at this hour, the shops and houses still dark and silent. The familiar landmarks, the diner, the gas station, the old library, seemed distant, like they belonged to another world. A world where monsters didn't stalk the woods and angels didn't wield swords of light. I pulled into the gravel lot behind the church and killed the engine. The building was small and unassuming, its white paint peeling in places and the cross on the roof slightly askew. I'd never been much of a churchgoer, but in that moment, the sight of it felt like a beacon, a place of safety. The door was unlocked, creaking slightly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of wood polish and old books lingering in the air. I hesitated for a moment, then called out softly, "Pastor Graham?" "It's Ethan." There was no response at first, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake coming here so early. But then I heard the sound of footsteps, and the old pastor appeared from a side room, his face lined with concern. He was still wearing his rumpled shirt from the day before, his tie slightly askew as if he hadn't slept. His eyes widened when he saw me. "Ethan," he said, his voice tinged with relief and urgency. "You're all right." "Thank God," I nodded, though I didn't feel all right. "Pastor, I need to talk to you. Something happened, something I can't explain." He gestured for me to sit down in one of the wooden pews, and I sank onto the hard surface, my legs still unsteady. He sat across from me, leaning forward with an intensity that told me he already knew, at least in part, what I was about to say. I told him everything. The creature, the way it had stalked me through the woods, the attack on the cabin, and the terrifying chase. I described the radiant figure, the light, the sword, the way it had driven the creature away. As I spoke, Pastor Graham listened silently, his hands folded in his lap, his expression grave. When I finished, the church was so quiet that I could hear the faint creak of the old wood settling. "You saw it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Saw what?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "What was that thing? And what was the figure? Was it an angel?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe so. What you encountered was not of this world, Ethan. The creature you described, I've heard stories, whispers of such things, but I've never known anyone to face one directly and survive." "What was it?" I pressed. "Why did it come after me?" Pastor Graham hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There are forces in this world, Ethan, forces of light and darkness, locked in a battle that most people never see. Sometimes those forces intersect with our lives, and when they do, the consequences can be profound." "That doesn't answer my question," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Why me? I'm nobody. I live in a cabin in the woods." "I don't." "You underestimate your importance," he interrupted gently. "None of us are truly nobody. Sometimes the enemy sees something in us that we can't see ourselves. Perhaps you've been chosen for something greater. Or perhaps your very existence is a threat to the darkness. Either way, you've been marked." "Marked?" The word sent a chill through me. "What does that mean?" "It means the battle is far from over," he said, leaning closer. "But it also means you are not alone. The figure you saw, that was no accident. Your prayer, Ethan, that was the key. It called for help, and help came." I slumped back against the pew, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to think, what to believe. Everything he was saying sounded impossible, and yet I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. The creature, the angel, the way the light had shattered the darkness. "What do I do now?" I asked finally, my voice barely audible. "You prepare," Pastor Graham said firmly. "You pray. You arm yourself, not just with weapons, but with faith. And you stay vigilant. The light has protected you, but the darkness will not give up so easily." I nodded slowly, his words sinking in. I didn't fully understand what was happening or why, but one thing was clear: my life would never be the same. The battle wasn't over, and if I wanted to survive, I'd have to fight. The days that followed were unlike any I had ever known. After my talk with Pastor Graham, I drove back to my cabin under the first rays of dawn, the quiet stillness of the road feeling more like a fragile truce than true peace. The memories of that night played on an endless loop in my mind. The creature, the light, the words spoken by the angelic figure. "You are protected. Stay vigilant." The cabin didn't feel like home anymore. What had once been my sanctuary now seemed exposed, vulnerable. I spent hours patching up the broken back door, hammering the wood into place while the wind whispered through the trees. Every sound, every rustle, every creak set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. A spark, small but undeniable. Hope. The angel had come for me. It had answered my desperate prayer, protected me when I had no other way to fight. That thought gave me strength. That night, I knelt by the fireplace, my hands clasped tightly together. It felt strange at first, like I was trying to remember a language I hadn't spoken in years. I stumbled over the words, unsure of what to say, but I spoke them anyway. "God, I don't know why you chose to help me. I don't know what you see in me, But thank you. And if there's more I'm supposed to do, if there's some reason all of this is happening, please show me." The fire crackled softly as I sat back on my heels, waiting for something. A sign, maybe, or a voice like the one I'd heard on the road. But the room stayed silent, the only light coming from the flickering flames. Still, I felt a strange sense of peace, like my words hadn't just disappeared into the air. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the windows, a welcome contrast to the night. I decided to drive into town, not because I needed supplies, but because I needed to see other people, to remind myself that the world hadn't completely shifted into chaos. The town square was bustling with life. Shopkeepers setting out their wares, children laughing as they chased each other down the sidewalks. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again, like the events of the past few nights had been a bad dream. But that illusion didn't last. As I walked past the diner, I overheard two men talking in low voices near the entrance. They weren't locals. I would have recognized them, but their words stopped me in my tracks. Another one, out by the Miller farm, one of them said, his voice grim. "That's the third this week. Any witnesses?" the other asked. The first man shook his head. "No, but the signs are the same. Claw marks, the livestock torn to shreds. Whatever's doing this, it's not natural." I froze, my stomach twisting. Claw marks. My mind flashed back to the gouges in the wood outside my cabin, the way the creature had stalked me through the woods. Could it be the same thing? Or was this something else entirely? I forced myself to keep walking, my mind racing. If more attacks were happening, then the darkness wasn't finished. It had retreated, yes, but it hadn't gone far. Pastor Graham's warning came back to me, sharper now. The battle is not over. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I didn't know what I was preparing for exactly, but I knew I couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. I stocked up on supplies, extra shells for the shotgun, batteries for the flashlight, a sturdy knife I hoped I'd never have to use. Back at the cabin, I reinforced the doors and windows, even setting up a rudimentary alarm system with string and bells. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. That evening, Pastor Graham paid me a visit. He didn't say much at first, just sat with me by the fire, his hands folded in his lap. Finally, he spoke. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he asked. I nodded. "The attacks, they're happening to other people now. I heard about it in town." He sighed heavily, his face lined with worry. "The darkness doesn't give up easily, Ethan. It's persistent, relentless. And when it marks someone, it doesn't just stop with them. It spreads. Then how do we stop it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "We can't just wait around for it to pick us off one by one." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness? Hope? "We fight," he said simply. "But not just with weapons. You've seen what the light can do. That's our greatest weapon, Ethan. Faith, prayer, the belief that no matter how dark it gets, the light is stronger." I wanted to argue, to tell him that wasn't enough, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew he was right. The angel hadn't defeated the creature with brute force. It had driven it away with light, with power I couldn't begin to understand. Before he left, Pastor Graham placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "You survived for a reason. Don't forget that." The days turned into weeks, and I began to find a rhythm in the chaos. I prayed every morning and every night, not just for myself, but for the town, for the people who didn't even know the darkness was creeping closer. I started helping where I could, fixing fences on farms that had been attacked, checking in on neighbors who lived alone. Each time, I felt that spark of hope grow a little stronger. Strange things began to happen. Small miracles, the kind that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been looking for them. A sick neighbor made an unexpected recovery. A missing dog turned up miles away, unharmed. And each time, I felt that same warmth, that same presence I'd felt the night the angel appeared. The darkness was still out there. I could feel it, but so was the light. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back. One night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the low growl, distant but unmistakable. My heart raced, but this time, I didn't freeze. I stood, the shotgun in one hand and the Bible Pastor Graham had given me in the other. "Not tonight," I said aloud, my voice steady. The growl faded, swallowed by the night, and the warmth returned. The battle wasn't over, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't alone.